You point out in the chapter on Are Jews Generic that 0.1% of the people in the world are Jews, but 29% of the Nobel Prizes in science and literature are Jews.
Yes.
Where did you find that, and what does that mean to you?
It'll be in the footnote. I've read so much stuff I can't pinpoint it. But what it means to me is that, among other things, that there is one of many examples of groups that are wholly disproportionately represented in particular areas. And it shows what a farce it is that intellectuals and even the courts think it is something remarkable when there's some group is X% of the population, but Y% of the people in this profession or that institution. That's true all around the world. And it's not just Jews, it's Germans, it's Japanese, it's you name it. You turn on television, it's blacks in basketball. You know, you just run everywhere. And yet, despite this empirical reality that you simply can't escape, people are determined to believe that anytime the groups aren't represented in proportion to the population, something strange must be going on.
This is maybe too general a question, but what determines the way most people think about others in their lives? I mean, what's the base of someone's own prejudice? And what have you found?
Gosh, I don't know. That's the only real answer I can give you. I wrote a book about the assumptions from which people start, about assumptions about human beings in general. This is a book called Conflict of Visions. And once you start with a certain conception of human beings, an awful lot of other things follow when you talk about justice, about power, about equality, about all sorts of other things, depending on what's your assumption about the nature of man.
If you were still living 50 years from now, what would you predict the black race in this country would be?
Oh, wow.
I mean, based on trends that you've seen in the last 50 years.
It could go either way. If the current trends continue, it's going to be a disaster. But there's evidence that the current trends are not unchallenged. People from time to time ask me to mention some black conservative writers. And I tell them, 30 years ago, I could have told you Walter Williams and me. And today, I can't even keep track of them all. They're all over the place. They're in the media, they have their own shows, they write columns, they write books, and I learn about them, from nowhere they suddenly appear. So there is this counter trend going on, and everything depends upon which wins out in the end.
How much of a role have you played in guiding them, the conservative black writers?
I have no way of knowing. You'd have to ask them. Most of the people who, sometimes I'm credited with having influenced this person or that person, but Walter Williams, for example, had arrived at the same conclusion that I had before I ever met him. And in fact, that was his whole reason for wanting to meet me. So that it's so easy to reconstruct these things to fit some notion, but it's what I call putting 2 and 2 together and getting 7. That Walt had his own ideas before I ever came along.
Is there someone in your own life you credit with having the biggest impact on the way you think today?
Not really. The biggest change, well, I guess at one time, Marx, if you'd asked me in my 20s, it would have been Karl Marx. But the change from that was not brought about by reading someone else. It was about from experiences that I had and things that I learned as time went on.
And what one experience would you credit with having the biggest impact?
Oh, working for the Labor Department in the summer of 1960 and discovering, one, that there was plenty of evidence that the minimum wage was in fact costing people their jobs. More than that, discovering that the people in the Labor Department really were not interested in that, because the minimum wage, administration of the minimum wage was supplying 1/3 of the money that was keeping the Labor Department going. So for me, the question was it helpful or not? And for them the question was, are we going to really, I can remember the sense of consternation when I suggested an empirical test of this. As if, my God, this man has stumbled upon something that could ruin us all, And once I realized that, I realized that institutions have their own agendas and their own incentives, and what they were set up to do really is not controlling.
So what did you do with that finding that you had back, was it 1960?
Yes.
Because you said you've been writing since 1960.
Yes.
Did you go right out and start writing after you learned all this?
No, because I couldn't get, I was supposed to write a doctoral dissertation on this, and I tried to get the data, and the data simply are not there. I mean, to get data that are truly relevant is very hard in many cases. I mean, you can always get some numbers, throw them together, and come up with a conclusion. But if you're serious, you find that there are very few sources that have good data.
Let me divert just for a moment. If we saw you in your habitat writing, What would we see?
Oh, you would see, first of all, a mess in the office.
This is home.
Home. And you see me at the computer with my Windows 95 just struggling with stuff, that's all.
And what time of day would you be doing most of your writing?
I have no schedule because I have no classes, I have no office hours, and so on. And so it's whenever. And so around, I guess around 2 o'clock this morning I was working, but at 8:30 this morning I was fast asleep.
How often does that happen?
Often. There really is no schedule.
Do you watch much television? How do you stay up with what's going on in the world?
I watch television selectively. I watch news and public affairs programs, some of them. And I watch sports. I haven't watched ABC News, for example, in decades.
How about NBC News?
Not a lot since then, in those same decades. I mean, ever since the invasion of Grenada, and ABC News featured a story about how American soldiers landing in Grenada were wearing the wrong kind of uniforms. And I thought that was really not the significance of the Grenada invasion.
Back to your book, the third chapter is The Real History of Slavery.
Yes.
What is the real history of slavery?
The slavery was much bigger and involved infinitely more people than people have realized. It was not confined by race. It was not defined by race or created by race. It existed for thousands of years. A history professor had a student come up to him and ask him, well, when did slavery begin? And he said, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, when did freedom begin? Because slavery existed as long as we have any records. And from archaeological finds, we realize that people were enslaving other people before they could read and write. So that's always existed, and it's existed all over the world. The number of white people enslaved by pirates in North Africa was greater than the number of Africans brought to the United States. You know, and yet that's not even mentioned in most of the discussion. So I tried to look at slavery as a worldwide phenomenon, and it's something that's lasted for thousands of years. I also tried to ask the question, why did it end? It ended here because of a civil war, but it didn't end anywhere else because of that. It took over 100 years to root it out. And again, the literature, there's tons, you can find the shelves groaning with books about the United States, the Western Hemisphere, and Africans, but virtually nothing about the rest of it. This book about the Europeans enslaved by North African pirates came out in 2003. By 2004, you couldn't find a copy. It had, for all practical purposes, going out of print. There was just no interest in it.
What should this knowledge that you put in this chapter, what impact should that have on people who read it in this country? What impact do you want it to have on them?
Well, I guess I want them to understand what the facts are, which, you know, is a major undertaking in itself. And also realize that racism in the United States grew out of slavery, but slavery didn't grow out of racism. The Europeans enslaved other Europeans for centuries before the first African was ever brought to the Western Hemisphere. That wherever there were people that were vulnerable for whatever reason, those were the people that were preyed upon. Even though for most of history, those who enslaved and those who were slaves were the same race.
Have you ever gone back and looked at your own family history?
Not really. No.
You have no idea where your folks came from originally?
No, I guess I don't know even the names of my grandparents.
On both sides?
On both sides. Partly it's because I'm an orphan, and so that there was that link was cut. But I really don't know the names of the people who would be my grandparents in the adoptive family either.
Did you ever know your original parents?
No, I have no. My father died before I was born. And my mother, heavens, I was so young that I have no memory whatever of her.
Next chapter is Germans in history.
Yes.
And I guess the question I wanted to ask you after reading part of it is, were the Germans unusually anti-Semitic?
No, the Germans were not more racist than other people. All the evidence that I was able to find was that in general they tended to be less racist, not only towards Jews, but towards blacks in the United States, towards the American Indians, and towards the Aborigines in Australia. And so that the really chilling conclusion I draw from that is, if what happened in Germany could happen among Germans, it could happen anywhere, and none of us should feel safe.